Good evening. I'm Connie Cirillo-Freeman, Director of Arts and Culture and Seniors here at the JCC. I have just a couple of housekeeping items as we get started. We are recording the program and we expect to have it posted on our website next week. We'll send the recording to all of the attendees. We'd like you to please put your questions into the Q&A. The chat is disabled, and we'll address as many as we can. First, I want to acknowledge and thank our book and art committees for providing their invaluable support to our arts and culture programming, and to JSAC, our JCC Social Action Committee, which is sponsoring this evening's program. Of course, our wonderful staff makes everything we do possible, so we thank them. We are so pleased to welcome Andrew Feiler in conversation about his book, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. The book tells amazing stories in words and beautiful photographs of one of the first collaborations in America between Jews and African Americans working for civil rights. Our moderator tonight is Jed Selkowitz. Okay. Jed is the Senior VP and Chief Marketing Officer for Americares here in Stamford. He provides both strategic leadership and hands-on tactical execution of the global health nonprofits, marketing and communications efforts. Jed has over 20 years of senior marketing and strategy experience. Prior to joining Americares, Jed served as the vice president at iHeartMedia, a mass media company that specializes in radio broadcasting and producing live events, where he oversaw strategic brand partnerships with companies like American Express, AT&T, and Johnson & Johnson. Jed spent 20 years at the Coca-Cola Company, where he ultimately oversaw entertainment marketing in North America, including oversight of key partnerships, including American Idol, the Oscars, and the American Music Awards, just to name a few. Jed is on the board of directors of We Are a Family Foundation, the Jack and Jill Late Stage Cancer Foundation, and Future 5 in Stamford. And we are so lucky to have Jed on our JCC board of directors. Jed, it's all yours.
Thank you, Connie. Appreciate that kind introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight for what I think will be a terrific presentation and discussion on the book, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. I want to introduce our speaker tonight, Andrew Feiler. Andrew is a fifth-generation Georgian. Having grown up Jewish in Savannah, he has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Andrew has long been active in civic life. He has helped create over a dozen community initiatives, serves on multiple nonprofit boards, and is an active advisor to numerous elected officials, political candidates. His art is an extension of his civic values. Andrew's photographs have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian, Architect, Preservation, Eye on Photography, The Forward, as well as on CBS This Morning and NPR. His work is displayed in galleries and museums, including solo exhibitions at such venues as the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, and International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. His work is in a number of public and private collections, including that of Atlanta University Center and Emory University. Andrew's newest book of photography that we're here tonight to speak about is titled A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America, published by the University of Georgia Press. This work is the first comprehensive photo documentary of the program created by Tuskegee Institute principal Booker T. Washington and Sears, Roebuck and Company president Julius Rosenwald. From 1912 to 1937, this collaboration built 4,978 schools for African-American children across 15 southern and border states and transformed America. Here with us tonight to talk about the book, but also this unique partnership is Andrew Feiler. Welcome, Andrew.
Good, thank you. It's great to be with y'all. As you know, this talk was originally scheduled to be live, but I appreciate everyone's flexibility and for the moment, and I'm pleased to be able to join you from my home in Atlanta.
Terrific. Andrew, Andrew's going to speak for a bit about the book, and obviously he's going to share some of the amazing photography in it. And then I'll rejoin after Andrew's done giving his presentation to kick off the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to it at the end. So Andrew, without further ado, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jed. This has been an extraordinary run as this book came out in, let me just say, I've been a serious photographer most of my life. About 10 years ago, I started down this path of taking my work more seriously and mercifully being taken more seriously. My first book came out in 2015, and this book just came out May 1st. It was featured in this exquisite double-page spread in the Wall Street Journal and Smithsonian Magazine, two sort of life milestones for a photographer. It's won a number of awards. The prints have started to go into some permanent collections. And the exhibition of this work that's accompanying this book premiered here in Atlanta at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which was a wonderful partner in bringing this work to a much wider audience. That exhibition begins to travel next week, where it will open at the Charlotte Museum of History, and it then travels to my second exhibition at the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. It will then go to the State of Tennessee Museum in Nashville, the brand new Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans, and the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, and it will travel beyond then. This weekend, I'm just starting to book into 2025. So it's really been a gratifying experience, and I'm honored to be able to share it with each of y'all. So I am going to share my screen. Oh, there we go. Not that fast. Okay. Just making sure I can get the technology to work here. Okay. A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. I'm going to start inside the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald hangs on the wall of the schoolhouse. Julius Rosenwald was born to Jewish immigrants in Springfield, Illinois, immigrants that had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up in Springfield across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. If you go to downtown Springfield today, sorry, I had trying to solve a little technical problem here. There we go. Okay, go to downtown Springfield today. There's a 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historic Site, where they have preserved the historic homes, and directly across the street is Julius Rosenwald's home. In fact, Peter Ascoli, the biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that he went down to Springfield to research his biography. He is sitting in the office of the superintendent of the National Historical Site, and he says to him, "Do you happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's birth home was?" And the superintendent says to him, "You're sitting in it." It's actually the offices of the National Historical Site. And at the time, there was not a plaque out in front of the home to commemorate it. Now there is a plaque, and that plaque was placed there by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Site. Legislation cleared the Congress at the end of last year, requiring the Secretary of the Interior to do a feasibility study. And the vision would be a visitor center in Chicago with 3 Rosenwald schools in each of the 15 program states, except Missouri, which only has 1 surviving school. It would be a multi-site National Historical Site. I serve on the advisory board of the campaign to create this park. And when this happens, and it will happen because Dorothy Cantor, the force behind it, is truly a force of nature. When this happens, it will be the first component of the American National Park system to honor a Jewish American. So Julius Rosenwald rises to become president of Sears Roebuck and Company, and with innovations like Satisfaction Guaranteed or Your Money Back, he helped turn Sears into the world's largest retailer of his era, and he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history, and his cause is what later becomes known as civil rights. And he is specifically motivated by his Judaism, for he sees America as a safe haven from anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America is treating its African-American citizens. And he says, I believe in America, but I do not see how America can go forward if part of its people are left behind. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle in the president's house at what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically Black college in Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. Now, this is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former teachers, former students, and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. In fact, the image on the cover of my book is a photograph of the restored classroom in this school, and in the back left-hand corner, you can see this quilt hanging in the schoolhouse. Now, the two men, Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, meet in 1911, May 18th, 1911, in Chicago. Last year was the 110th anniversary of their meeting. And you have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. At the end of the Great Migration, at roughly 1970, 56% of African Americans live in the South. It's one of the largest internal displacements of people in human history. But in 1911, 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions did not even have public schools for African Americans. Julius Rosenwald is invited by Booker T. Washington to join the board of Tuskegee, which later in 1911, he takes the train down to Tuskegee. He's impressed with what he sees, and he agrees to serve on the board. But the two men develop this close friendship, and they keep talking, what can we do together? And in 1912, they create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. This is a photograph of students and teachers in front of the Jefferson Jacob School in Eastern Kentucky. The structure of the program is genius. They reach out to the Black communities of the South, and they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and we will count as your contributions cash, land, material, or labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate in creating Black-white dialogue, and these have to be public schools. While we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. Now think about this. The Black community has to participate. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants in American history. The white school system has to agree to participate. It's one of the earliest examples of public-private partnership. Now, before I want to pause for a second and tell you something else about this image that's important, and that is the program began with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team could keep an eye on the program. And Booker T. Washington has photographs made of these just like this, the students and teachers standing out in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities. And he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved that he is committing to expand the program. And these photographs continue to be made throughout the entire history of this program, of students, teachers representing their communities, understanding the role of education as the path into America. And it is because of the power of photography at this moment in the history of this story that all of my bodies of work prior to this body of work were in color, but I decided to shoot this body of work entirely in black and white and entirely horizontal in recognition of the role that photography played in the history of this program. So they reach out to these communities. And in 1912, when the Lochapoka community begins to raise the funds for the match, to become the first community to build a Rosenwald school, and that's in Lee County, Alabama. This is the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia. The last Rosenwald school in 1937, President Roosevelt presides over the dedication ceremony of this school. From 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states, and the result is transformative. But before I get to that, I want to tell you a detail, a really fascinating detail of the Eleanor Roosevelt School. Franklin Roosevelt, this is Meriwether County, this is Warm Springs. Franklin Roosevelt had seen a Rosenwald school in Meriwether County, and he called up the Rosenwald school. This is before he is president. This is in 1929, and he says, we need an additional Rosenwald school in Meriwether County. Well, it's 1929. The recession has set in. The school board is unable to make its contribution. The Black community is unable to make its contribution, and the idea languishes. Well, the program, the Rosenwald Schools program formally ends in 1932. It's actually from 1912 to 1932, 20 years, that they built 4,977 schools. But in 1937, 5 years after the program has ended, President Roosevelt calls up Edwin Embry, who's running the Rosenwald Fund, and says, okay, I'm ready for my school. And Edwin Embry says, well, Mr. President, the program formally ended 5 years ago, but for you, Mr. President, we'll make an exception. The Rosenwald Fund contributes, the Black community contributes, the white school system plays its role, the WPA contributes, and the head of the WPA goes to the Oval Office to report to President Roosevelt on the progress of this school, and he reports to President Roosevelt that they are $1,000 short. And in the Oval Office, President Roosevelt pulls out his checkbook and writes the $1,000 check that closes the gap. The last thing I'll say about this schoolhouse is that when it closed, it was bought by a local family and became a place where they stored, this is a family that made cabinets. This was used as storage. So you see the windows have been bricked up. The building is distressed. It is for sale. It is actually now, courtesy of a collaboration with the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, this schoolhouse has been preserved been purchased with restoration easements put on it, and it is now controlled by a brother and sister team that are raising the funds to restore the schoolhouse and turn it into a community center and museum. So as I said, the results of this program were transformative. There are two economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. What their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrated Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. Now, I will tell you, so I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, as a member of Mikveh Israel, the 3rd oldest congregation in the country. The congregation, I'll just add, was founded in 1733. In the 1980s, my mom became the first female president in its history. But I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. But 26 years ago, I moved back to Atlanta. I have lived in the 5th Congressional District the entire time. Congressman Lewis was my congressman for 25 years. And so Congressman Lewis was the most prominent At the time of this project, Congressman Lewis was the most prominent alum of the Rosenwald Schools program. And so I reached out to Congressman Lewis and I asked if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said to me, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald Schools. I just know I went to school there. And I said, Congressman Lewis, I will have an essay in this book, and there'll also be 2 essays by prominent African-American preservationists. We have the history covered. What I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What role did education play in your life? And he said, oh, I can do that. So it was on October 29th of 2019 that I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office, sitting at the round desk in the middle of his space, working with him on this introduction. And it was exactly 2 months later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with his pancreatic cancer diagnosis. I didn't start out from this project expecting to have an experience like this, but what an extraordinary opportunity to have had this one-on-one experience with Congressman Lewis. And indeed, his contribution to the introduction to this book is one of Congressman Lewis's final public acts. And the last thing that I'll say is you'll see that there are a number of portraits in this book. And I want to use this portrait to explain a little bit about the visual language of my portraiture. Congressman Lewis's staff had said to me, can we do the photograph in the Atlanta office? And somewhat boldly, I said no, because to me, the setting of these images is part of what they are about. And for Congressman Lewis, I wanted this to be in his Washington office because that was a statement of power and a statement of achievement. In addition, I never told anybody what expressions to put on their face because I wanted them to have agency and how they and I told their portion of this story. And I never told anybody what to wear because I wanted them to be authentic. And Congressman Lewis stood up, his jacket had been drooped behind the chair, and he put his jacket on and he looks up at me and he says, I have this cancer awareness ribbon on my lapel. Should I take it off? And I said, Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you. And that is the authentic you, leave it on. And what a poignant coda to the history that was to come. So this is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, the oldest known surviving Rosenwald school, constructed about 1915, the early history of the programs. Later in the program, there's much better data on exactly when schools were constructed. In the early years, it's a little bit more ambiguous. So I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until February of 2015, when I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who had originated the role of African-American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And the story shocked me. I'm a 5th-generation Jewish Georgian. I had been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald schools? So I came home to this desk and I Googled Rosenwald schools, and I found that there were a number of books on the topic, but there was not a comprehensive photographic account of this program. And so I set out to do exactly that. In over 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 program states. Of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 survived. Only about half of those have been restored. I shot 105 at the surviving schools. And the result is this book. I'm going to bring you inside this Emory School, because I want to talk a little bit about the architectural idiom of the program. And in order to do that, I have to tell you the story of Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect, and he was hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, which is in itself a National Historic Site, many of the beautiful historic buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. And I will add that Robert Robinson Taylor's great-granddaughter is Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in the civic life of Chicago, and for the entire 8 years of the Obama presidency, a principal aide to President Obama. So it is Robert Robinson Taylor and a team of architects who leads the team of architects at Tuskegee who lay out the architectural principles of Rosenwald schools. large 9/9 pane windows on the left to let in lots of light, because these schoolhouses often did not originally have electricity. On the right, cloakrooms where dirty outer garments could be left so that they would not sully the education spaces. Brick chimneys through which the potbelly stoves vented that kept the schoolhouse warm on cold days. And you see toward the back of this image a room divider. That divider originally had a series of doors that could be closed off to separate the two education spaces, or accordioned back to open up the entire space so it could be used as a community center after hours. That idea of schoolhouse as civic space and these basic design principles persist throughout the entire history of the program. And this is progressive era architecture in service to education. Now, that was what was known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school in the Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina. And if you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find in that museum from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. The state school superintendent of South Carolina was James Hope, and he was a big supporter of this program. It's why every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald schools. In fact, they had so many Rosenwald schools that the average number of Rosenwald schools in a county in South Carolina was 10. But the school fell into disrepair over time after it had closed. And James Hope's great nephew, Ron Hope, was a career Army officer, retired back to Newberry County, South Carolina, and took it upon himself to single-handedly restore this schoolhouse. This is what's known as a two-teacher school. This is a three-teacher school. In the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. And one of the basic architectural dictates, if you will, of the Rosenwald Schools program was that the schools were to be modest. That was in part to save money, and in part to avoid attracting the ire, otherwise known as arson, of the local white citizenry. But more specifically, one of the leaders of the Rosenwald Architectural Initiative believed that cupolas should be expressly forbidden on schoolhouses because a cupola was derivative of church architecture, and on a schoolhouse, it violated the fundamental construct of separation of church and state. But this schoolhouse has a cupola. Remember, the African American community has to contribute, and that can include land, material, cash, labor. This cupola on this schoolhouse is an expression of African American community agency in Hartford County, North Carolina in 1920 America. And indeed, of the 105 schoolhouses I went to, 3 of them actually have cupolas. Now, note what we've seen before: 1, 2, and 3 teacher schoolhouses, all small white clapboard structures. The vast majority of these schoolhouses were small, and that is largely because the African American community was not afforded school buses, so they had to serve a radius where the students could walk to the school. But by the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. It is from this schoolhouse that several members that graduated from this, what was then a middle school, were among the Little Rock 9 who integrated Little Rock Central High School. And if the Art Deco detailing of this school looks vaguely familiar, it's because the architect of Little Rock Central was also the architect of the Dunbar School. Now, I started out this project shooting mostly exterior images, but I realized that told an incomplete story, because you see, most of these schoolhouses were outgrown as educational spaces long ago. This is one of the rare schoolhouses still in use for educational purposes. In fact, of the 105 schools I went to, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. This is one of them. Dunbar is now a magnet middle school. But to have been able to preserve these smaller schoolhouses, they had to have been adaptively reused. And And in order to tell that component of the story, I had to get inside. And suddenly I need permission. And it was when I was reaching out to the people to get into these schoolhouses, to tell that adaptive reuse narrative, that's when I met all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, and I bring their stories into this work with portraiture. So I want to talk about this adaptive reuse narrative. These are the Pleasant Hill quilters in Cass County, Texas. 3 of these women attended Rosenwald schools. 3 had parents who attended Rosenwald schools, and LaJoyce Flanagan in the front row in the center was a teacher in this school. And this schoolhouse had fallen into great disrepair, and the Pleasant Hill quilters got together and they quilted and sold quilts to raise the money to restore the Pleasant Hill school and to turn it into the beautiful community center that it is today. And the women gather on most Mondays in the schoolhouse to quilt. This is the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, Pikeville, Tennessee. It has been turned into a community center by the local community, but you'll also notice that all of the walls and ceilings are covered in this exquisitely beautiful decorative pressed tin. This is another stirring example of the African-American community pride in their school and their agency in constructing the schoolhouse. Some of these schoolhouses have been turned into churches. Many of them were built next to churches because the churches often donated the land or spearheaded the fundraising effort. This is an example of one that was turned into a church, outgrew the schoolhouse and added on. And I'll just add, the family that was behind the conversion of the schoolhouse to a church is the family of Beatrice Holmes. And when my exhibition premiered here in Atlanta at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, the Combs family came down for a personal tour of this exhibition. It was really quite a wonderful moment. This is the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee, that has undergone a particularly exquisite renovation with this portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the wall in the shadow of these classic 9/9 pane windows that are such an iconic component of the program's architecture. But many of these schoolhouses are in great disrepair. This is the Hannah School in Newberry County, South Carolina, across the street from the Hannah AME Church, which is the namesake for the school, where it's the graveyard of the Hannah AME Church that's grown up around the schoolhouse, and in the kind of detail that you can just not make up. This school rises on Deadfall Road. But you see, this schoolhouse is in great disrepair and at risk of collapse. These spaces are the locus of history and memory, and preserving these schoolhouses and as precious historic resources is really incredibly important. And so there is an inherent plea in this work, this plea for preservation, so that we can restore these schoolhouses and save this historic fabric of America. And indeed, I came across in several places schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by yellow caution tape or emergency fencing. This is the W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, North Carolina, that had turned out had been demolished a week before I arrived, still with the Coke machine standing sentinel. But as I said, that is the people that were really the emotional heart of this story. This is inside the K. Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. The portrait of Julius Rosenwald hangs above this doorway, has hung in this schoolhouse since it opened in 1923. Brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley attended this school. Both went to college, both went to graduate school, and both became educators. Frank Brinkley taught high school math and science. Charles Brinkley became a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters. All 4 sisters attended this school. All 4 went to college. These 6 siblings have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened without this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Springs School in Forest County, Mississippi. This is the Hattiesburg area. But to tell you the history of this school, I have to tell you about Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer Sr.'s grandfather donated the 2 acres of land for the Bay Springs School. Vernon Dahmer was a student here. And when the schoolhouse closed in 1958, the schoolhouse reverted to Vernon Dahmer because his grandfather had built in a reversionary clause that if the schoolhouse closed, it would come back to the family. And Vernon Dahmer turned the schoolhouse into a locus of civil rights activism. See, Vernon Dahmer Sr. was the head of the NAACP in Forest County, Mississippi. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And when Vernon Dahmer Sr. drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he had them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicle and harassed. All of this, of course, drew the attention of the KKK. And on the night of January 10th, 1966, Vernon Dahmer's home was firebombed by the KKK. And Vernon Dahmer stood in the front window of his home with a gun, holding off the attackers so his wife Ellie could get their children out the back door. And Vernon Dahmer died from his injuries in that fire. This is Ellie Dahmer, the widow of Vernon Dahmer. Ellie Dahmer grew up also in Mississippi, went to a different Rosenwald school, went to college, came back and taught in the Bay Springs School. When the schoolhouse closed in 1958 because they had built a more larger consolidated school for African Americans, Ellie was denied employment because of her husband's activism. So she got a job in a different school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for 21 years. And their son, Dennis, has recently led the restoration of the Bay Springs School to turn it back into a community center to honor its community center roots. And that's the role that it plays today. And the last school I'm going to tell you about is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the moment, it is this day, it's in the midst of a restoration. And this is inside the schoolhouse. You'll see the modeled textures on the wall. That is primer. You see the plastic sheeting on the floor, protecting the floor from the painting that's about to happen. The potbelly stove on the right is also wrapped in plastic. The photograph in the middle of this image was taken in the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin McDonald, both of whom were born into slavery. And upon emancipation, they started raising farm animals. They acquired some land, they acquired some more land, and they eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donated 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher was their daughter. One of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this photograph of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. Elroy and Sophia went off to college, came back, and had an entire career as educators in Bastrop County, and they are now leading the restoration of this schoolhouse to turn it into a community center and museum. I found this story time and time again. Former students becoming educators, becoming the keepers of the flames of history and memory in their community. All of my previous bodies of work were really built entirely around the photographs, but I came across such extraordinary stories like the story of the Williams family that I felt compelled to write a short story that goes with every image, or in some cases, pairs of images. I found Rosenwald Schools connected directly to the Trail of Tears, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the litigation of Brown v. Board, murder, embezzlement. And so I hope that you'll spend time with these photographs, but I hope you'll spend time with the stories, because I think you'll be moved and I think you'll be inspired and a little bit more optimistic about the prospect of change in America. I want to tell you, I'm going to close on the image of this image of Leslie Parks Bailey. This book is predominantly about the Rosenwald Schools program, but there was one more program of Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy that was so important that I couldn't leave it out of the book. And that was the program that was created in 1928 and ran to 1948 called Rosenwald Fellowships. They gave grants to predominantly African-American intellectuals and creatives over that 20-year span. And it is the largest source of philanthropic money for African-American intellectuals and creatives in the 20th century. 587 grants. They also gave 278 grants to progressive white Southerners like Ralph McGill, newspaper editor Ralph McGill, playwright Lillian Smith. But in the African-American community, it is a veritable who's who of 20th century African Americans Langston Hughes, Jacob Lawrence, Marian Anderson, and Gordon Parks was the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald Schools grant, a Rosenwald Fellowship. And Gordon Parks was an enormous influence in my own work, because it was from Gordon Parks that I learned that you can synthesize your art with your activism. And I had the great privilege of meeting Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on book tour with his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. Well, roll forward, we're in Atlanta, and my wife and I have become friendly with Gordon Parks' daughter, Leslie Parks Bailey, who lives here in Atlanta. So I reached out to Leslie and I said, okay, Leslie, I'd like to bring your father's story into my book to tell the story of the Rosenwald Fellowships. And I'd like to have this idea that I would take a picture of you holding a photograph of your dad, made by your dad. And she's like, this is a great idea. And she puts me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation. And immediately I get an email with this photograph and said, this self-portrait was part of Gordon Parks's application to the Rosenwald Fellowships. And I thought that will work. And so Leslie is a yoga instructor, among many other things, a wellness advocate. But I had this idea that I wanted to do it specifically on top of a manhole, because one of Gordon Parks's most famous bodies of work was a 1952 photo essay in Life magazine that illustrated Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and the Invisible Man is coming out of a manhole. And so this was my sort of homage to Gordon Parks. So I just want to end on a couple of just sort of observations about the title of this work, A Better Life for Their Children. Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. The African-American communities who had to contribute to these schoolhouses, who were already being taxed to pay for white schools, had to dig deep to pay for these schools. They were looking for better lives for their children. And by reaching across these divides of race, religion, and region, they fundamentally transformed this country. And I think that there is a central message in this story that our individual actions matter, and they can indeed change the world. Congressman Lewis writes in the introduction to this book that each of us have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate. That when we see something that is not right and not just, we must find a way to get in the way. And so I'll close this portion of our program out with the refrain of Congressman Lewis's most fervent call: may we all find our paths to the making of good trouble. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you for that presentation. It's clearly there's just an incredible amount of passion and purpose behind the project and the book itself. I'd love to, the combination of the written narrative and the powerful images of these schools, the students, the teacher, really beautifully memorializes the partnership between Rosenwald and Washington, right? Can you speak a bit to the reaction of former students that have seen the book, and I'm assuming you've been able to bring some of the students and together, and maybe even some of the educators, and also share any other outcomes of the project as a result of your work, sort of codifying this history?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. First of all, let me just set some context around the question that you're asking, Chad. The relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is one of the earliest collaborations between Jews and African Americans. And there is a direct connection between that foundational relationship, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, marching arm in arm with our long white beard flowing, marching with Dr. King, and who famously says when he marches with Dr. King, it felt like his feet were praying. And what happened in Georgia exactly 12 months ago, where John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock crisscrossed this state together for 2 months in the runoffs. And Georgia sends its first African-American senator and first Jewish senator to Washington. They have built clearly not just a close political alliance, but a close personal friendship. That relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. I think that I think that the central answer to your question is I have been embraced by this extraordinary community of preservationists and former students and former teachers, because what they know these schools were so important to them, their community. There was incredible pride in their school. There was a pride in the role that they played in bringing education to their community, and education as this on-ramp to the American middle class. And they are grateful that I am here to tell their story. And I've actually had the really wonderful opportunity to bring some of them into the telling of this story. There's a portrait of, in fact, I showed the portrait you saw earlier of brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. Frank Brinkley was quoted in the piece in the Wall Street, in Smithsonian. There's the Noble Hill School. One of the last student, there's a portrait of one of the students who was in the last graduating class of the Noble Hill School. She was featured on CBS News when this project was on CBS News, and it's really been wonderful to be able to sort of help them tell their story, and so it's been a really gratifying experience to help sort of energize, in some places, the restoration movement, and to help these folks tell their really compelling stories.
Excellent. One of the questions that one of our attendees asked is, how well known at the time was the Rosenwald School program? So obviously now it sort of has this umbrella. I imagine that obviously both based on naming and funding and the model, local communities are aware, but how broad was awareness of the program, and what was the reaction at the time?
So many of the schoolhouses, so the communities were aware that they had that there was a match, and it was coming from a Jewish Northern businessman named Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald's photograph was up in a number of schoolhouses, not all of them, but at some level, Julius Rosenwald was a very modest man. He did not call this program Rosenwald Schools. He did not want it called Rosenwald Schools. In fact, Julius Rosenwald in Chicago was the philanthropist that put up the money that made possible the Museum of Science and Industry. They wanted to call it the Rosenwald Museum, and he refused. And Julius Rosenwald was one of the earliest philanthropists to say that he wanted all the money given away within X number of years of his death. That has become very fashionable in philanthropy today. Bill Gates has said that, Warren Buffett has said that. But Julius Rosenwald believed that the generation that helped create the wealth should be the beneficiaries of that wealth. And so he mandated all the funds should be given away within 25 years of his death. And in fact, they were all given away within 15 years of his death. He dies in 1932. The program shuts down in 1948. That is one of the reasons why Julius Rosenwald is less well known today than some of his philanthropic peers like Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller have surviving foundations. But in the Rosenwalds, in the Black communities, after the first generation, it wasn't necessarily, this was just their school. This is what Congressman Lewis said to me. I don't know much about the history of the Rosenwald School program. I just know I went to school there. Lewis was the third generation of his family to attend the same schoolhouse. And so I think over time that connection became less well known.
I want to go back to you started talking about the relationship between Senators Ossoff and Warnock, and sort of there seems to be a bit of a through line there. But for a good bit of time, there, really sort of during the civil rights movement, there had been an amazing alliance between Jews and the Black community. Particularly because they're in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and rising anti-Semitism and racism, there was sort of common cause. And so there'd been some really great examples over our history of alliances between individuals and the communities on a broad level. But following MLK's assassination, the relationship became more strained and frayed, and there had been a bit more of a go-it-alone approach to civil rights. But today we see, again, rising anti-Semitism alongside rising racism. And so there is common cause, but I don't know necessarily that we see the same scale of alliances and partnerships. So can you talk about sort of, where you see that relationship today. And I guess Ossoff and Warnock are certainly a great example of finding sort of a purpose of unity.
Right. I think that if you go back to the Jewish community and the African American communities coming together in the 1910s with this relationship, and what becomes the relationship during the civil rights movement, that represents a certain moment in time, a certain alignment of interests. While things have morphed over time, you can still say today that the two most prominent pillars of the Democratic Party's coalition are the African American community and the Jewish community. 90% of African Americans vote Democratic. 72% of Jews have voted Democratic for the last 20 years, despite lots of commentary over whether that relationship is changing. It's actually been stunningly consistent. And I think that reflects a common set of values between these two communities. And so I think what's important is to not get tied up in how the relationship may have morphed in the 1970s and 1980s, but the fact that there are common values, and that we are these communities are partners as we think about the progress that America still needs to make.
I want to ask one more question. In the afterword of your book, Brent Leggs says, and I'll quote it from the book, "Each Rosenwald building and landscape preserved today brings life to a revolution in education and philanthropy. They tell a story that is often neglected in American history. The struggles and fights for economic justice that these schools harbored fueled the civil rights movement," end quote. What can we learn from these schools, from the collaboration between Rosenwald and Washington, and what makes you optimistic about the future Leggs paints in the closing lines of your book?
So let me, I'd say two things that relate to that. My first book is a book called Without Regard to Sex, Race, or Color. It takes its it is a portrait of an abandoned college campus, and it takes its title from an inscription on the school bell, dedicated to the education of youth without regard to sex, race, or color. And that book is a portrait of these empty education spaces that resonate deeply with us because we are so familiar with these spaces. We've been in these types of classrooms, in these hallways, in these locker rooms, but we're used to seeing them populated by people, not by ghosts. And I use that narrative to tell the story that education has been the backbone of the American dream since before there was the United States of America. The first taxpayer-funded school was created in 1644 in Dedham, Massachusetts. That's how long our commitment to free public education goes back. And there's a direct connection between that, the Land Grant College Act in 1862 that creates colleges all across America, historically Black colleges in the decades after the Civil War, the Rosenwald Schools program, the education provisions of the GI Bill that transform America from relatively poor to relatively prosperous, Brown versus Board of Education, which is a high watermark of the civil rights movement. And yet, what are we talking about today, right? Crushing levels of student debt, college affordability, college access barriers. And so there's this 375 plus year narrative arc where education has been the backbone of the American middle class, the access point of the American middle class, and yet that's a tradition at risk. Which brings me to the second part of your question, what makes me optimistic? Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington are building schools for African Americans in the segregated South of 1912 America. That is a deeply optimistic act. And that is a multi-generational act. They knew that it would take, what they were setting up was going to take multiple generations to succeed. And as somebody who is deeply involved in the civic life of my community, I take great enthusiasm from understanding this idea that the combination of optimism and playing long ball And I think that is a guidepost for our times, that as we think about our own civic engagement, to be optimistic and play long ball. I think that's a great gift that comes from the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington.
I think it's a very a great way to end our conversation. Very optimistic note, and I certainly am one that will put my faith in it. So Andrew, thank you very much for delivering such a compelling presentation, and thank you for really gifting us with this amazing book and the collections within it. So if you'd like to see more of Andrew's work, please visit andrewfeiler.com. That's AndrewFeiler.com. Andrew was telling us before the webinar that there are actually 2 other Andrew Feiler photographers. So find the right one, and definitely dive deeper into Andrew's work. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to Connie for some closing remarks.
It appears that my screen has just frozen. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not.
We can.
Okay, great. So what can I say? This was an absolutely fabulous conversation. Andrew, you've given us such a beautiful book that enlightens us and about the enormity of the importance and influence of the Rosenwald schools on generations of African-American children who ultimately went on to make innumerable contributions to our society, our culture, and civic life. At the same time, they were striving towards making a more equal society for all. It's just amazing. So we have to thank you for this wonderful book and such an uplifting talk, and the message that moves us to take action for justice. So much appreciated. And thank you, Jed, so much for your masterful moderating and your excellent probing questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Connie.
You're most welcome. I just want to let you know about a few upcoming events here at the JCC. We have our Jewish Film Festival Winter Series with films in January, February, March, and April. We have our Gallery at the J Wine and Art opening reception for Deo Lutwama, who is an East African artist with beautiful paintings. We hope that many of you will be able to come to that. That will be in person. And then our upcoming book and author conversations, the next one is February 15th, and that is with Lisa Scodolini talking about her novel Eternal. And that is going to be virtual. Then we have Janice Kaplan and her book, The Genius of Women. That is going to be in person on March 15th. So please visit our website and you'll see our Facebook page, find out everything else that's going on at the J. Thank you all for coming and have a very good evening. Thank you.